All right, and we're live. Hey guys, this is Luke Johnson from the Noetic Philosophy, Poetry, Humanities Teaching app. Today I'll be discussing the Kant's essay, What is Enlightenment, with my friend Elisabeth Yang. So I'll just let Elisabeth introduce herself here.
Hi, my name's Elisabeth, as Luke has clearly presented, and I'm here to talk about what is Enlightenment. I'm a third-year PhD student at Rutgers University, and my specialty, the areas that I'm focusing on is history of child development, history of medicine during the early modern period, things like that. So, but I'm here to have some fun with some philosophy. Enjoy doing philosophy, religion, ethics, and bioethics and things like that. But this will be a fun sort of reflection on what Kant is trying to tell us.
Most definitely. Elisabeth and I met. What's really wonderful about this Noetic project is that Elisabeth and I met over a decade ago at, I believe, at a bioethics conference. And what's really been really fascinating in my own life as I've been putting together these materials and rebuilding the relationships, I hope it becomes a microcosm of what other individuals experience as they download the app and participate in the discussion forums and reconnect with individuals and bond with other people over ideas. I'm really happy that you agreed to participate in this. Let's just get right into the mix of it. I don't know. I am not a Kantian. I don't have perfect authoritative knowledge of Kant. So I wrestle, I struggle, I sort of chip away at this stuff. And the little bit I know about the historical background to this particular essay is that it's relatively short. It's like 6 or 7 pages. I have it in an anthology of Kant's political writings. What happened is that, like I believe, let me see the name of it, the translation, the Berlin Monthly held a call for editorials in 1784, right? And Kant wrote in to the newspaper to answer the question, what is enlightenment? And we have his response here. Could you imagine that? Kant writing into the New York Times or the Washington Post or something like that? I mean, it's
kind of interesting. Yeah, I mean, it's, this is all happening towards sort of the latter end, so to speak. And this is the time when they're sort of reflecting on, well, what is this that we're actually doing? Reflecting on the whole entire sort of process. But yeah, I mean, I can't imagine Kant just submitting this in and, writing over break or something like that,
Yeah, yeah. And I think you sound like you have a better grasp of history. Maybe it would make for an enriched educational experience for us to maybe say what's going on in European history at this particular time. 1784, I am no student of history. I've always sort of disavowed history because I didn't like particulars and I always liked universals. But as I've gotten deeper into the study of philosophy, I've started to realize how the historical epochs very much shape the philosopher's ideas. And you can correct me on this, but the French Revolution happened in 1789, right? And Kant is writing this in 1784. He's I guess he must be familiar with what's going on in America and is anticipating the revolutions that are going to happen in Europe. And, he's going to be very quick to come. He's not going to want this radical change right away with whatever the principalities, the monarchs, the enlightened despotism that's going on in Prussia and Europe at that time. But what's very interesting is that in Europe, we have this move towards the deification of reason in France, and this move towards democracy and an experiment in democracy. And then we have a reign of terror that goes wildly wrong. And then we get Napoleon, a dictator, which some people view as an antichrist figure of sorts, who then goes about taking down all these kingdoms and kind of democratizing Europe. It's kind of interesting. We typically think of this march towards democracy as being a pretty linear thing, but it's actually much messier than that. I don't know if you want to add anything to that historical stew that I just said. Since I am not a student of history, I may have said something really wrong there too.
No. I think, you're describing. I'm hearing a part of it, if that's okay. But no, you're perfectly right on that. It's right now, this is sort of at the throes of, okay, we're sort of getting rid of, we're replacing sort of this medieval worldview, right? And understanding of the cosmos, notions of authority that are found in sort of, as Kant puts it, sort of secured by these guardians of knowledge, whether it be sort of a religious dogma, political dogma, kings and authorities and other things like that. We're sort of overthrowing this with the age of reason and so what he calls the modernity, whatever that may be. And so that's kind of the overall sketch. I mean, you've sort of described it well, but it does turn bloody. Foucault, as Michel Foucault sort of describes it, you try to describe what is enlightenment, and like he says, and I think he puts it rightly, that it's not something, it seems like a very simple sort of question, messy. And I think Kant does a good job of really promoting that more messy, realistic view of the Enlightenment. That it's not something that's very sort of, he's not definitely condoning the rationalist view, nor the empiricist view. He's doing something quite different. He's not going back to ancient Greeks, nor is he going to purely of the empiricists. He's doing something quite different. He's not doing something more of the religious idea of what the theologians may have promoted. He's doing something kind of quite a synthesis of these different worldviews. And so, but like you said, it is something that's quite messy.
Yeah. And we have to look at the reasons for why it might be messy. So, and I think something else that we want to keep in mind as we discuss this essay is trying to think about how it maybe fits into the larger Kantian program, the ethical program, the political program. I don't know how much background we need to really say about that. I'm not like the best person to ask about Kantian ethics, but I mean, I think if anyone needs a refresher on that, I mean, Kantian ethics is essentially going to be something to the effect of that reason is going to be the sole determining ground of one's moral activity. And this is going to ultimately free you from external determination and allow you to have ethical autonomy. And the maxim of ethical activity is known as the categorical imperative. It's purely a formal law that you sort of put your particular scenario into, and if it's universalizable, doesn't admit of a contradiction, you can proceed with it. Having a lot of what Kant's going to be talking about, but we're not really so much talking about the ethics so much. But it's good to think about how that ethics fits into this essay. And I think what we probably need to do is one of the most insightful aspects of the essay begins with, I think, in the first paragraph or whatever, where Kant goes about using a bunch of terms and defining a bunch of terms that are going to be pretty essential. And so there, I've got it kind of broken down here. And on page 54, in answer to the question, what is enlightenment? Kant says, enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-incurred immaturity. Oh, wow. That's like really illuminating, right? That makes total sense. Right. So enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-incurred immaturity. So we have to ask ourselves, what does Kant mean by immaturity, and what does he mean by self-incurred? And we have to ask ourselves also what he means by emergence from that. So
right.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm gonna try to answer that immaturity question. Is there anything you want to throw in there before I go to that?
I think perfectly, it's very good to question what does he really mean by all this, and if what are the implications of what we can, Kant means when he says, to be enlightened is to escape from this self-incurred immaturity. Well, does that leave with some of us that are probably, near age 40 or whatnot, still in a case of, not being enlightened beings because we haven't escaped a sense of immaturity. So it kind of puts a lot of things into question, but we can definitely kind of go into that.
Well, we can psychoanalyze each other at the end and determine if you or I have emerged out of immaturity, or we're still in a process of becoming. I don't think it's ever actually achieved. I think it's something that is a dynamic process through our entire lives. I don't think you're like, I am enlightened. I'm like this, hovering Buddha. I got it figured out.
Right. I'm a Buddha. So.
Yeah, I think it's a lifelong endeavor, and I think writ large, it has to be renewed with every generation of humans. So let's try to get our minds around this question about what Kant means by immaturity. What's holding us back? And on page 54, he says, immaturity is the inability to use one's own understanding without the guidance of another. Mm-hmm. Okay. And we're going to get a little further down what some of those sources of immaturity are, like who we're relying on to do our thinking for us. So, yeah, essentially, we're outsourcing our thought. And I mean, look, we are a couple hundred years removed from when this essay was published. I think a real question that we'll want to return to or throughout the discussion here is to figure out, are we any more enlightened than Kant's time? Like, are we still relying on the guidance of other people to do our thinking for us? In some ways, you might actually be able to make the case, and what Noetic's mission is trying to combat is that we might actually be more dependent on the guidance of others than ever. I think about the echo chamber of social media and how that can drive opinion. I think about how we have self-selecting 24-hour news cycles that cater to our political point of views. It's very interesting how in modernity you would think that we have all this access to information, but I'm not really sure people are really exercising their own understanding like they ought to be. How do you feel about that?
No, I think that's entirely true. I think we're inculcated with messages coming from all over that tell us basically who we are, that can tell us who we are. And I think a lot of us, especially the younger generations, take this in without much reflection. And this is the kind of reflection, this process that I think Kant wants to promote. And so it's hard to say. I mean, it's not just for younger folks, but also, folks of any age. We are all these, stuff from social media. We rely on what traditions and authorities, whether it's government, while we are sort of casting sort of fun and making fun of these authorities, we are still taking some of them at face value. And a lot of the information that we get through the magazines and things like that. I mean, even for women, I think they do receive a lot of messages about what is beauty, what is truth, things like that I think we do it, subliminally. It happens subliminally. And
yeah. And I'm very eager to make this point because I think why products like Noetic haven't really been made before is that there's a lot of deference to like quote unquote experts. And if I haven't said it already, Elisabeth and I are really just two people who really care about ideas, who are doing our best to navigate through this task. And we're not going to outsource our thinking to experts. And I think I hope that you and I set an example to others that they can do this themselves, right? And I don't want anybody to hang on whatever words that we say as like the gospel truth. And similarly, like you brought up the point with women, what I'm so thankful about your participation in this project is that I think your presence sends a strong message to women that they can be a part of this philosophical conversation, because I'm very concerned, for whatever reason, about the lack of minority and female perspectives in academia, especially in philosophy. And that's probably a topic for another day, but I think you just showing up and doing this with me, like, is an enlightening process, not only for ourselves, but maybe for other individuals.
Mm-hmm. It definitely, it sort of expands the notion of the Enlightenment project, that it's not the Western male conception.
Yeah. Yeah. I worry that people don't take philosophy seriously because it is pushed out women and minorities that the whole thing can be written off as just like the metaphysics of white dudes. And I find that to be very problematic.
No, it is problematic.
When this is really, and really this is, I feel like this is an enriching activity for everyone, but I digress. I mean, it's relevant to what we're talking about. But
I'm happy to be here, Luke. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, thanks. So we've talked a little bit about immaturity, some sources of the immaturity, and Kant goes on to enumerate some of them, but there's this other thing that we need to define, this what it means for it to be self-incurred, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
why are we infantilizing ourselves? And if you want to answer that, or I could try to answer that, like why Kant thinks that that's going on.
Yeah, I'd like to hear your view on that. Why do you think that?
Yeah, it seems to be, I mean, he seems to be kind of pretty blunt about it. He seems to say that it's really a matter of cowardice, really, and that we're lazy. We have grown so accustomed to other people doing our thinking for us. And it's really easy to be immature. At least in his time, he felt like, oh, like people didn't have to do the thinking for themselves because this book does all the thinking for me. Like that book does that, so I don't need to go and explore enlightenment because that book did that. Or like my clergyman or something like that, he's got all that spiritual stuff figured out, so I'll just let him do the thinking for me. That's what his job is. I've got, other things to do. And he, interestingly enough, and since working in medicine a little bit, you can speak to this, Kant even found it problematic that we do so much outsourcing to doctors, which may seem backwards or not. But I have, as I've gotten older and I've seen a number of doctors over the years, I've come to not see them as like these Olympian gods. There definitely are so many things that medicine and science doesn't have figured out, and it's an evolving process. Not that I'm anti-medicine or anti-science, that every patient has got to do their own.
No, you're perfectly right. And I think doing sort of participating in the enterprise, doing the history of science and doing the history of medicine, this reveals to us that science in and of itself, that medicine in and of itself is not something that's purely sort of an objective, impartial craft. People are influenced by politics, by religious interests, by, personal beliefs of any sort. And so, or economic, reasons. And so in a way, we can't take doctors' regimens for what's considered to be healthy, right? Or the best for us at face value. I think we need to think critically. We need to, just as you mentioned, as Kant was pointing out, in our everyday lives and what may happen to us, we need to consult with other doctors and get other opinions and on a doctor's sort of prescription for what is best for us. And it's not to disregard what the doctor's saying, but it's to really, develop your own understanding, as Kant would do, to have your own understanding, right? To dare to know.
Yeah, and it's not just that it's not just that, like, I know, probably belaboring this point, but it's not just that like doctors are fallible, finite beings that can make mistakes, but there are societal economic pressures that sometimes force doctors to go in certain ways.
Right.
There are sometimes financial incentives for them to use certain drugs over others that may conflict with our own personal health, and
Right.
we need to do our
Yeah, exactly.
So Kant says, guardians of us, these spiritual advisors, our medical advisors, are the professorial figures, right? Like they've got to, like, they think they've got to, like, not take us off the leash. They can't let us run free because they're like, if you think of us, if like all of humanity we're like these like domesticated pets and we get taken off the leash, like we'll just run in front of cars, or we'll fight other dogs or something to that effect. They've got this sort of paranoia that somehow they need to keep us on a pretty short leash. But Kant's going to say, you know what, we don't need to really be afraid of that. I mean, yeah, it's not going to be a smooth transition. Like we will make mistakes and fumble and fall as we ever to think for ourselves, use our own understanding without guidance. But he thinks that we'll eventually fight our way through it and arise out of barbarism into some sort of enlightened state.
Right. And I think that's, again, sort of the promotion of sort of a human reasoning, really sort of putting out on a pedestal and promoting that, really having a faith, so to speak, in human reasoning to bring us through.
Yeah, and it'll be hard because like there are a lot of traditions that have been set up to say like this particular theological formula or this medical formula or this spiritual or ethical formula, like that this is how it's always been or whatever. But those things, if we don't think that through them for ourselves, just serve to really anchor us to immaturity. We never experience the cultivation that's such a rarefied breed of person, presumably Kant includes himself in this, has actually been able to ascend out of, you know?
Right. And I think, interestingly enough, that it challenges the notion of our developmental perspective of, you know, of age, you know, in a way that, you know, by a certain age, you should have things, you know, you need to get it together, you need to understand the world as such. And that's not necessarily true, I think, in Kant's view. I think it's sort of, I think regardless of your sort of physical age, you know, it's this sense of, okay, standing outside of that and saying, am I, you know, acquiring understanding on my own without the guidance of others? When am I being reflective? And I think that can happen at any age.
Definitely. Yeah, someone else that we've covered on the Noetic app is Simone de Beauvoir, and she talks about how it's very possible if people don't take control of their own lives, that they exist in a position of metaphysical privilege where they essentially remain children all their lives. They never really take full responsibility. I don't know if you've read her, but I'm in love with Simone de Beauvoir. She is a fantastic existential thinker, and I think she would fit nicely with this essay.
Yeah.
To explore that further. What's interesting here is that on Kant on page 55, you know, if these guardians of ours were to take on a sort of more enlightened perspective, he thinks like this view would ultimately disseminate. He says such guardians, once they have themselves thrown off the yoke of immaturity, will disseminate the spirit of rational respect for personal value and for the duty of all men to think for themselves. So in a slow way, this will start to spread if the people at the top become more receptive to the idea of people using their own understanding and figuring it out for themselves. Kant seems to want a very conservative unfolding of an enlightenment because, as we mentioned earlier in this seminar, we talked about how he was very concerned with violent revolution because you can just swap out one set of prejudices for another. It's like, oh, great, like we hate this thing, we hate this enlightened despot, we overthrow him, but then like everything goes awry, and then we get a Napoleon, and we don't really know if we like him either, you know?
I think what's also important, and this, whether this is sort of directly relevant, but you know, I think it's important to note and highlight that, you know, Kant does say to be enlightened, it really relies on a structured freedom. You know, there is some structure to this freedom. It's not sort of, you know, free for all, sort of, you know, out of bounds. There's some kind of structure to it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that is great. So I think the question is what type of freedom is Kant concerned with? Like, what type of freedom do we need for enlightenment? He doesn't want like anarchy.
Right.
So specific form of it, but innocuous form of freedom that he
Right.
wants us to make use of. Do you recall what that is?
Yeah. So he talks about a rational freedom, you know, and well, what does he mean by rational freedom? You know, and how does that relate to that notion of acquiring understanding, your own understanding? And he uses the phrase that sapere aude, you know, dare to know on your own.
Yeah.
And it's kind of what do you mean by that? Does it mean, well, I'm just going to think what I think, and whatever I think is the right way to go? And I don't think that's the case so much, you know, just to will what one thinks all the time. I think he has a different sort of notion of rational freedom.
Yeah. So there seems to be two tiers to it. Do you mind if I try to illuminate that? I don't want to step on your toes.
Oh. No, of course not.
Okay. So he seems to think that there is all that's really needed is, in order for enlightenment to steadily progress, is that you need to understand this distinction between public reason and private reason.
That's right.
Public reason is this ability to call into question the existing institutions and like how to improve them and how to make them better and to allow people to argue and allow for for consensus to build from that public reason. Now, the private reason is like what you do in your sort of civil post that you've been assigned to. So to like maybe pick some examples, and I actually think there's some tension that comes out of this that I don't know if is fully resolved. For instance, if if we take a very innocuous example, say like I am a postman, right? And I am like low on that chain of command. I use my private reason to carry out specific orders that are handed down to me. But if I just think the Postal Service is total garbage and that competitors like UPS or FedEx or something like that have actually figured out a better chain, a better way of doing things, I really shouldn't be punished within an enlightened society to go on Facebook and be like, yo, UPS does this so much better. Why aren't we doing this at the USPS or something to that effect? Like there shouldn't be no retribution because I'm in a public forum using my public reason to reason about how to make this particular institution better. But so long as I'm in the private realm and I'm using my private reason, I have to be obedient and follow through with that chain of command. But I think it gets, and he wants to talk about how like examples that I could see being potentially problematic. And this gets into like one of the areas where I'm hazy on this essay, and maybe we figure it out and maybe we don't, and maybe someone else comes along and helps us with us, or maybe you figure it out for me, is that if you are like, you know, or a clergywoman or something like that, there is like, you are swearing an oath and like, you don't really have that ability to take a view that is oppositional to the church in a public forum. Like you're constantly a representative of that institution. Right. Similarly, but he thinks you ought to be able to, like that you ought to be able to critique the church that you're a part of. Similarly, like if you're a part of the military and you get like assigned to do some foreign policy adventure or whatever, that it able to speak out about that in a public forum. But I don't know if it works that way.
It's sort of a gray area, you know, what constitutes sort of, how does he stand between private and, you know, and how are you free in that? And I think that's something that is sort of a problem with Kant, or a problem that a lot of people have with Kant's thinking. He sort of sustains this tension. I think he does that, this tension between sort of a very base, sort of immature, laziness sort of state, and the transcendent sort of, you know, pole. And so there's kind of putting this dichotomy in front of us. It means to think freely and to, you know, to participate in community with others. I think for him, you know, rational freedom is not so much a solitary, kind of what I get from reading his response is that it's not a solitary enterprise. It's something that involves the community. Quite important that the community is key to being free, to you know, being free, rationally free. And so I think that's something to keep in mind.
Why do you think it is so important that the community fit into that? I mean, I have sort of a reason for why he thinks that we attain our freest thinking so long as it's integrated into communities, but I'd like to hear your take on that.
Yeah, the sense that I get from Kant is that for him, he doesn't want to kind of slip into the rationalist mode of human reasoning where, you know, everyone is entitled with this gift and this faculty, right, of reasoning, and therefore we'll all come because we're under the equal light of reason, and then we'll all come to the same conclusions. I don't think he necessarily subscribes to that completely and wholly. I think he does something a little bit beyond that. I think he says, well, we need the participation of others where we disagree with one another, right? Where we debate one another, where we can criticize one another. And then we don't necessarily have to come to a consensus, that we can actually disagree with one another. Closed system, somewhat closed system. I don't know how he keeps it closed, but there's a piece even in light of that disagreement, and that in order to actualize, true autonomy, a mode of discourse that includes division and thought. So again, it's this tension that I think he wants to maintain. That's my take on it, if that makes sense.
It's that like collaboratively, if everybody's exercising their rational autonomy together, we're actually to more ideas and greater exercising of our rational thought, because so like we actually become freer in the exchange of ideas.
Right.
Seems that, even though, like you said, it doesn't necessarily mean that we ultimately agree on everything.
Right.
So yeah, we've this tension. You'd have to ask. At least within our society, I mean, we're historically progressed from where Kant is. Like, are our institutions, like, I'm not really sure if someone in the military can go out and get on Facebook and speak out against a particular policy that they may be asked to act out in a private way, or if an individual within the clergy could do the exact same thing.
Right. I think, yeah, that's something to think about for sure. I mean, again, like, I'm imagining myself as a clergywoman. If I, swear an allegiance to the church, there are certain things that I need to commit to regardless of whether I, but at the same time, I should be open to freely questioning these things, because it's not a true faith and it's not a true allegiance, I would say, or I would argue, if I didn't really reflectively why I am doing this. And so, but I don't need to know entirely why or what the case is. So again, I think it's this notion of, I think it's a sort of a description of faith that I think Kant adds a different angle to.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, what's interesting is that I think you would say that these institutions, if they don't allow for that public reason, are actually, impediments to the Enlightenment project. So maybe he would render harsh judgment upon, our institutions within this supposedly modern enlightened era, I should say. What's interesting is that he talks about these oaths that we have to swear, and he's particularly interested in religious institutions, and we'll get into that for why he says what he wants, if with the church example, if someone has to swear an oath or come up with some sort of legislative policy within the church, he says like the test for it, right? Like the way that that test would ever have any sort of legitimacy, he says on page 57, particular measure can be agreed upon as a law for a people. We only ask whether a people could well impose such a law upon itself. And I think what he wants to happen there within church congregations, and we'll revisit why churches are so important to him, is that he thinks that will allow for those individuals that are in more progressive churches to call into question theological doctrines, and if there are individuals who want to remain in more, I guess, and these designators don't really mean much, conservative positions, and not advance those, and it allows for that. And we have what's interesting is that Kant seems to be working out, and I'm not sure I totally understand this, and I probably need to lean on you a little bit, is that he seems to be trying to work out this separation between church and state, because he wants the churches to come up with doctrines and laws that the enlightened monarch can then integrate within civil law, right? So if the churches come up with ideas that don't integrate within civil law or whatever, the monarch's job, as he perceives it, things in, is to make sure that they don't trample into that there's supposed to be some sort of unanimous whole. But ultimately, the strange thing about this period of enlightenment, and we can talk about some of the historical pressures that Kant had to deal with, is that he was living under, I believe, Frederick the Great. And Frederick the Great, I suppose, had the reputation of being, as far as monarchs go, enlightened. But I think he was also very concerned about what was to come. Frederick the Great's successor, and I don't know the whole story of Kant's writings and stuff like that, but we get this kind of like part of the essay where it seems like Kant is not only sort of saying, hey, Frederick, like this is your role in terms of how to stay out of these public disputes and allow us to sort of sort out our salvation and our free press and stuff like that for ourselves, but also buttering him up to make sure that he advances a lot of these reforms that Kant is advocating. Do you have much to add to that? But it was a bit of a struggle for me to understand this tension of like coming up with law that then were submitted to the crown, which seems anti-enlightenment, but the monarch is this preserver of the civil and religious institution and is supposed to somehow keep them separate.
Yeah, it's not that clear. I think it's particular also. Well, if you look at in France, but I mean going back to this, I mean I think it's particularly important. I think Kant may have been in doing this and in speaking to Frederick because of who would come after him. The person that comes after him, of course, is more sort of a religious fanatic, so to speak, and falls.
Do you know his name?
Oh goodness, that's a good question. I need to go back to my notes.
Oh, it's not that important, but I think that's right. I think there was the person that came after Frederick the Great was I believe I read this somewhere too, that he was more engaged in religious enthusiasm and fanaticism.
Exactly, and it's I think it's a fear or a concern actually rather of what's to come, and I think that's why there's a sort of a fervency towards we need to understand and exercise what it means to be enlightened, and before this may happen, we don't want to fall back into this purely sort of religious, ethos or religious mindset, medievals and before the scientific revolution, anything that was sort of pre-scientific revolution. I think what you described was pretty accurate in terms of what was going on. It's hard. It's really something to think about and really question as to the relationship between church and state in that situation, because that is something that I don't know how it's practiced and practicalized, in light of what they mean by holding, challenging authority, having your own understanding, but at the same time, there is a sort of submission and a recognition of authority at the same time. So I'm not quite sure. I think it's something to really think about further. But,
yeah, I think so. I mean, look, this essay is only 6 or 7 pages long. So, I mean, to get into Kant didn't really have a lot of time to get into that. And I imagine there are other political writings where he develops these ideas much more so. I think it's probably getting the ball rolling. What I thought was sort of interesting, and I didn't know if it struck you as odd, when I think of like kings, I when I reflect back on like previous eras in thinking about kings, like I didn't necessarily think that people viewed them as like by the consent of the governed, right? Like, and Kant seems to talk about Frederick the Great that way, like as like, hey, like it's cool that you're monarch and all, but like you're there just to make sure everything functions. Like you're there to like make sure the trains run on time, if we had trains at that period. I'm not sure. Like he's like, but like understand, like if you like start to depart from that course, like you start to become a despot, and well, there are a lot more of us than there are of you. Right. He doesn't threaten him, but he like there isn't this obsequious like, oh well, you are like somehow like this descendant of some like divine right nonsense. Like he's like, no, you're pretty much there just to make sure that all the laws are stabilizable. And I didn't know that was really a view with a lot of people still living under kingships and stuff like that. It kind of shows an interesting snapshot of the evolution of political structures.
Right, and I think also it extends, the similarities extends to that of religious authority. I mean, during this time, you see the overthrow of the Catholic Church, particularly the Jesuits, the sort of disbanding of the Jesuits, and you know, prior to that, in the mid 17th century, we have a sect called the Jansenists, and I won't go into this deeply, but you have a sect of the Catholic Church in France that was sort of spearheaded by Pascal and his fellow Jansenists. And they start this this uprising against the Jesuits, fellow Catholics within the church. And within that, during that movement, challenge religious authority, but they also challenge religious authority in the realm of education. How are we teaching our young kin, our young folks, to think logically? And they come out with these different books of logic and pedagogy. But again, the Jansenists, the Jesuits, they want to sort of obliterate, eliminate anything that smells of Jansenism, because it smells suspiciously of Calvinist thought, and something that the French Catholic Church did not want at all. So in a way, this is, some time later on, where you see in the 18th century that the Jesuit church is being disbanded. And I think that this has implications for how children and how people are viewed to reason and to be enlightened, in a sense. I think this is sort of kind of a trajectory of what was going on in centuries before in France, within the Catholic Church itself.
Yeah, that's really fascinating historical background. I didn't know any of that stuff. I think that adds a really nice dimension to this. Okay, here. So, yeah, I think an interesting. So Kant, towards the end of the essay, he ponders aloud. At his time, do we live in an enlightened age? So 1784, Prussia. Mm-hmm. And do you recall what his answer is?
Well, he has several answers, and I think one of them we touched on was this abandonment of the state of self-incurred immaturity. I don't know if we sort of resolved understanding what that meant, but it's that he talks about three maxims, and I don't know if you came across that.
I don't know if I have the three maxims there. I do. The only answer that I have for that, and maybe I'll let you address those three maxims, because I don't have that in my notes. But what I had was that he renders the negative. He says, from what I was able to say, he's like, no, we do not live in an enlightened age, but he says we do live in an age of enlightenment. He thinks there's a long way for people to go in terms of using their understanding and religious matters, and he thinks they're still assisted, but some obstacles have been removed. And he's like very complimentative indirectly to Frederick the Great. He says, a prince that does not mandate that certain things must be believed ought to be celebrated. And he just thinks, hey, be patient with this. We'll work ourselves out of the barbarism, and that this is not just going on within Prussia. This is going to spread all over Europe, that this sort of ecclesiastical debate will happen. Mm-hmm. So that's how I had in terms of the answer for that. About, unless you want to talk about why perhaps he hones in so much on the religious issue or religious institutions rather than I don't know, other institutions like the post office or the military or something like that, or the university. Right. He seems particularly fixated with that. But so maybe you should say something about these three maxims, because I must have missed that.
Sure, and I'm sure I'm not sort of making this up, but he does discuss these three maxims that constitute what he considers to be sound judgment. And just to go with the first one, we've already sort of touched up on two of them, and it's the sapere aude, to dare to develop your own understanding. So that's the first maxim, and that's again related and linked to the idea of the abandonment of the self-incurred immaturity. So that's the first maxim that's involved. Wisdom, this kind of enlightened state, right?
Right.
And the second maxim involves the notion of putting yourself in someone else's shoes, right? So to try to avoid and overcome a subjectivism. And personally, I kind of struggle with this. You know, how does Kant view subjectivism or overcoming subjectivism? You know, how does that speak to the subjective, you know, objective dichotomy, even within his mindset? But for him, he assumes that one can overcome a subject where you can actually go outside of yourself and think from this sort of universal perspective. So this is the second maxim. And the third, the final maxim, involves the ability or the tendency to think coherently and consistently, with oneself. So, you know, some commentators have you know, argued that it's actually sort of a combination or a re-emphasis of the conjoining of the first two maxims, where you have the right of reason, and you have this emancipation of reason, and the autonomy being sort of overcoming that subjectivism, and the emancipation being sort of this liberation, you know, of passivity from this state of cowardice, from this state of laziness, you know, that he relates immaturity to. So, so in a way, it's okay. How do we take all these three? Well, yeah, he says, let's take all these three maxims, and this is what constitutes, you know, enlightened thinking, enlightened reasoning, or rational freedom of some sort. But the sense of what is enlightenment, I think he uses as part of an answer to that question. I thought those are some things that are kind of interesting. And again, this is not comprising his complete answer. It's not his complete answer to the question, but it's something that I think is integral to his thinking.
Totally. I'm really thankful. Yeah, I'm really thankful that you took time to explicate those. As this closes out, what's kind of interesting is like I'm trying to figure out, you know, his fixation on the religious dimension of it, and he says that, you know, part of the reason why he doesn't address like the need to safeguard or to purify the arts and sciences, he says for whatever reason rulers seem not to be terribly interested in controlling those matters. But they do seem very susceptible to getting involved in church doctrine, and then when they get involved in the church doctrine, then they start messing with the sciences and stuff like that, and that the priority needs to be placed on properly understanding the need for debate and robust discussion within those religious communities and how that's integrated into civil law. He also says something to the effect that he believes religious immaturity is the worst kind of immaturity. Like that's worse than the other ones that we listed off in terms of not, like ignorance, where we have the book that does the thinking for us, and we have the doctor that does the medicining for us. And I guess that's I don't know. Maybe this is maybe you can speak to the historical aspect of this. Maybe it was because Europe had been beset with so many religious wars, and there's so much unnecessary bloodshed as a result of Protestants and Catholics fighting each other, or crusades. Maybe he had that on his mind. I'm not sure, but maybe he saw like a lot of needless suffering as the result of people not thinking for themselves within religious communities.
Right. I think it's, you know, I can only speak to it generally, but I think, you know, it's part of that larger project of what the Enlightenment was trying to do, is that it was trying to promote philosophy, human reasoning, from theology, sort of planting theology. So theology was known as sort of the queen of the sciences. In a way, it's sort of feeding to that narrative of, okay, let's supplant this queen of the sciences, the handmaiden, right, so to speak, theology with philosophy. That, in a way, Kant is trying to do that, where it is kind of curious, because Kant, at the same time, he still maintains, even in spite of talking about freeing, human reasoning and rational autonomy and things like that, and abandoning your own judgment without the guidance of others and challenging the authorities. He still wants to maintain the transcendent ideals, the existence of God. He wants to maintain that. He wants to maintain the eternity of the soul, human dignity. And my question is, how does he sustain that? How does he hold that in light of this Enlightenment project? While he's challenging religious authority. So that's my question, because there's this tension where he's trying to, again, promote this, trying to argue for the reality of the synthetic a priori knowledge, right? Where you can access knowledge of these truths that are related to the divine, right? The existence of God, things that we can't really, argue mathematically for, but in that, and yet religious sources. And so again, I don't, that's something I'm trying to understand and grasp. It really does.
Well,
I don't know if you agree with me or not, but
I really appreciate you bringing this up. It's almost like I planted that question in you, because I'm simultaneously with this, I'm actually developing a seminar on Kant's religion within the bounds of mere reason. And if you have enjoyed this experience, maybe you can that with me too, because he takes up a lot of those questions. And Kant is, I can give you a very preliminary answer on that, but what he's going to say is that ultimate, reason is going to be the determining ground, not only of morality, but of a type of rational faith, that Kant had to limits of reason in order to make room for faith. And he's going to, in that book, he talks about how there are certain practical needs of reason, aside from speculative needs, where postulations for God and the immortality of the soul arise, and they are not provable, like you said, but yet he believes they are necessary for a moral resolve. And I can see that, but then there are raised questions about how they do not infect the moral incentive, how they do not infect the ability to do moral virtue for the sake of an afterlife. And if that starts to happen, then that really isn't freedom for Kant, because then you're just kind of you're not really doing it because it's in accord with right reason. But that's not really like a super profound critique. I know a lot of people have said that, but I'm anxious to see how Kant gets himself out of that corner that he's painted himself into. Because, like I said, he did believe in God,
right.
But that belief was not necessarily knowledge. Knowledge for Kant was going to be a marriage between concepts and intuitions. And God and the soul are super sensible things that nothing in experience can offer sensible intuitions to. So they're not knowable. But that's a whole other thing. And if you're interested in that topic, you should take the Noetic seminar on that.
Yeah, that sounds great. Sounds great.
Great plug. So I guess to kind of close it out here, Kant kind of says, hey, Frederick the Great and whoever comes next, you got to let your people think. You got to let them debate. It may be messy, like you mentioned earlier. They might get in arguments. They may not totally reach consensus. But having an enlightened populace is in your best interest, Mr. Monarch. And then I have to really stand back and ask myself, well, that's certainly in, well, you could even debate this. I mean, we're fed from the very beginning that we grow up in America that democracy is like the best thing. And don't get me wrong, I'm a Democrat in the widest sense of that term. But, you know, he's going to make the case like, oh, yeah, it's in your best interest, Mr. Monarch, for you to have this enlightened populace that isn't determined by outside assistance.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if he really successfully makes that case. I can see why a monarch would want to keep his people submissive.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, I'm trying to think why a monarch, because ultimately, if the people get the notion that they don't need any guidance from outside sources, they'll be like, hey, why can't I run the country? Why does that guy get to run the country? And then we have democracy.
Right.
And there are no more monarchs.
No, you're perfectly right. It's so interesting. I think with Kant, he still challenges us, you know, up to this day. I mean, continually. But, you know, for him, I can't escape the notion of when he talks about freedom, it being structured. You know, what does that mean? Structured freedom and involvement of, you know, reason. He has, I think, an over-reliance on reasoning, human reasoning in particular, that it'll all sort of amalgamate and cohere. And he has this faith and reliance that, yeah, this will all cohere, you know, if you do it correctly, you know, if you follow the program correctly, if you reason correctly, if you're enlightened, if you reach that state of enlightenment. But I think it's important, one of the notions that he really promotes is that reasoning shouldn't be passive, that it should be active no matter what. It's something that it's not just a gift or skill that we acquire, and that to be enlightened doesn't necessarily mean to acquire knowledge. It really means to use your reason freely. But then, you know, within a certain structure, you know, it's the structured freedom, you know, you're always going back to that, but it's a standard, or it's a norm. It's a norm whose validity is sort of only, you know, it's constantly probed, it's constantly, you know, acted on, it's constantly reviewed, it's constantly questioned. I think that's what reasoning and what it means to be enlightened is. That it's not just, okay, here's my knowledge of the world, but it really is something that I'm challenging constantly and doing this in participation with others. That's truly to be free, right. You know, the notion of freedom, freedom of human reasoning. So,
well, hopefully through the course of discussing this, hopefully we have advanced the cause of rational freedom, political freedom, and our little seminar. Is there anything that you would like to say in closing?
You know, I think there are other things to talk about with Kant. I think I'm really particularly interested, for selfish reasons, what his conception of child intelligence and child cognition is, you know. So are children ever considered enlightened beings, you know, if he has this, you know, in light of his conception of, you know, this immaturity, well, what does that mean? So does he exclude, are children been excluded from this enterprise of enlightenment, you know? So what does he say to that? But I think it's also important
I know he does write a book, and I have read it many years ago. But it's a book entitled Education, and I think he, from what I can recall of it, don't quote me on this, but I think he puts forth an educational program that will bring children into the realm of rational agents, into this. It will help them transition into this mentality of enlightenment, but I'm not so familiar on the mechanics of that. And obviously children are going to be, and kind of have to be, they kind of have to be, like, you know, you wouldn't want on a 4-year-old determining what their medical route would best be, right? Like, otherwise, because then they just eat cookies and not get vaccinated or something, you know? So presumably there is a period where children need to have external determination, but when that emergence of thinking for oneself happens, and how we make that happen. I'm not sure I have the answer for that, but I think Kant took it up in that book, Education.
Okay, thank you. That's something to look to and maybe discuss on another time. But no, this is great. I think it's important also to reiterate, the fact that Kant, really wanted to teach his students. He didn't want to teach his students philosophy, but how to think philosophically. And I think that's, totally in line with the whole project of what it means to be enlightened. It's this sort of being active and using reasoning but again, I think these tensions that we find, dichotomies, I think are helpful and shed light and promote further discussion into what it means. But yeah, I enjoyed this time.
Yeah, it was so wonderful. Yeah, it was so wonderful catching up with you in this way. We can talk more another time, but look, it was a real joy to have you be a part of this project, and you have an open invitation to work on this with me at any time in the future. And I think it would be great to work through Kant's Education. And if you would like to sit in on the stuff on the religion within mere reason, that'd be great. And we can talk about maybe doing some other stuff too. But let's cut it off there, and we'll do some future planning, and we'll let everybody else get back to what they need to get back to.
That sounds great.
All right, thanks, Liz. Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth. And everybody,
right.
Yeah, download the Noetic app. All right, take care.